Hello and welcome to another edition of A Chat With. And on this special edition of A Chat With, we are going to take a look at the life and career of the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis. Born September 29th, 1935, passed away in October of 2022 at the age of 87 years old. And in that 87 years, he lived himself a life like you would not believe. And with me to talk about the killer is author of the book Rock and Roll Unraveled, Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing very well. Great to see you again, Sam. And what a character was Jerry Lee Lewis.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
as you
aptly
as you
called the
just
killer.
heard, we had um, the great tune, his first song that was released that was a hit. Well, second actually,
Yeah,
Whole Lot of Shakin', and that is a great rockin' tune. Good way to start off the show, I thought. And
absolutely.
we've got a couple of other good tunes we're going to get to later on in the chat. But let's talk a little bit about the killer. Now, he was a bit of an enigma. He was a bit of a, how to describe him would be, I guess, he was, without being evil, he was the devil personified. He was mischievous. He was kind of into what he wanted to be and what he perceived he needed to be a star. What are your feelings on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, aptly called the killer. What's also interesting is the country music really runs through his veins right from his very first performance when he was about 10 years old. At Faraday, his hometown, Faraday, Louisiana. And the first thing he ever performed was Drinking Wine Spo, D.O.D., originally recorded by a guy called Stick McGee and his buddy in 1947. And interestingly enough, that particular song he re-recorded when he joined Atlantic Records in 1949. In 47, it was Stick McGee and his buddy. In 49, it was Stick McGee and his buddies. So he obviously made a few friends along the way. And that was actually Atlantic Records' first major hit. But what's interesting as well is that the Bible played a big part in Jerry Lee Lewis's early life. His cousin was Jimmy Swaggart,
Yep.
and he actually enrolled in Bible school in the September of '50 in Waxhaw in Texas. So the guy's a real enigma in terms of personality and background, and the way the industry sees him as well. He's very much seen as a rock and roll artist, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its first year, 1986. But most of his hit records are actually on the country charts. So, what an interesting guy.
Yeah, and he really had an impact on early rock and roll in the 50s
Oh,
and
absolutely.
going into the early 60s. Over the span of his entire career. Now, when I say that, I mean like that's going right up into the 2000s. So we're not talking just his early career, but he had 40 albums,
Yeah,
77 singles that he released. 12 of those singles became number one on the country chart,
yeah,
which, as you said, was part of his being who he was. And he also he had awards, just honors by everybody.
yeah.
You mentioned the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was a member of the Memphis Hall of Fame, the Country Hall of Fame, just to name a few. He won 4 Grammys, including a Hollywood Walk of Fame, and he was a member of an unofficial quartet that was one of the richest quartets around, the Million Dollar Quartet, which was Carl
Absolutely.
Perkins, Elvis Presley, and Johnny Cash. And then there was a second class, which included Roy Orbison later on.
Yeah.
And so, like, he knew what he was doing and he knew how to make it work.
Yeah, he also had a very, very distinctive piano style. I mean, his Sun records are credited to Jerry Lee Lewis and his pumping piano. And I think that's a great description of it. because that Million Dollar Quartet, he'd only just joined Sun Records, and he was there because Carl Perkins was recording Matchbox, and Jerry Lee was in there essentially as a session musician, playing piano for Carl Perkins.
But he also had his demons that he had to deal with. One, he had a temper. Two, he doesn't know how to count. He had a couple of times where he was married to two women at the same time, on two occasions. Like, it's not even that he did it once, he did it twice. He married his 13-year-old cousin, once removed. And that's why we're doing this special, because this first part of the special is prior to his marrying Myra, and the second part of the will be afterwards, when he has to fight back from the downfall of it. But let's start off with the beginning, when Whole Lotta Shakin' was released. It came out gangbusters. It ended up being number 3 on the Billboard charts. What do you feel was the draw for that song that made it so popular and brought him to stardom so fast?
Well, it's just a great song. It's actually a cover of a blues song. Big Maybelle had the original version of it. But what's interesting is, I mean, that was a massive hit right across the spectrum. It was the number 1 for 2 weeks on both the R&B and the country charts, and it got into the top 10 in the UK as well. So, it really established it. I think what we're looking at, 1957, I mean, rock and roll now is, very well established. Elvis's rise to fame across 1956. So, when you get to the beginning of 1957, rock and roll was everywhere, on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think he came very much in with the same sort of energy as someone like Little Richard. And he just, in a way, it's like Little Richard, he personified rock and roll. If you watch him perform standing at the piano, standing on top of the piano.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes. The guy was a real performer as well, as just a rock and roll artist.
Now, he came about the feel of rock and roll honestly. He was in a small town, and there was a house that was actually a jukebox joint that he could hear the music in, and he would go and listen to the music there all the time. And it pumped out a lot of rock and driving blues, and it kind of grabbed him. How much of an influence do you think that actually was in his music?
Oh, I think there'd be a lot of influence there as well. And he famously toured with Chuck Berry. 1958, Alan Freed used to do his big beat tours with a half a dozen different artists. And famously in the March of 58, they were on the same tour. And Chuck Berry considered that he was much more the established artist, but Jerry Lee just before that had 2 or 3 big hit records. So they were arguing about who should close the show, and Alan Freed decided that Chuck Berry should close the show. So in true Jerry Lee style, he went on stage, gave a storming performance, set fire to his piano, and apparently as he came off and passed Chuck Berry in the wings, he said words to the effect of "Follow that."
Yeah, so, and that's a famous story, and it is depicted in his biofilm, right. Great Balls of Fire. But apparently, in as we look at it from our side of it, that was really a true event in the sense of nobody wanted to follow Jerry Lee Lewis. Was it a factor of they couldn't top what he was doing, or that what he was doing was just so out there they didn't want to try to top it?
I think you couldn't top a Jerry Lee Lewis performance, because it was all theatre as well as just music. I mean, there was a similar situation at the Monterey Festival with Jimi Hendrix and the Who. And because Jimi Hendrix set fire to his guitar, the Who used to smash up the drum kit and the instruments at the time. And they had exactly the same situation then. Neither wanted to follow the other on. And I think that's part of it. With Jerry Lee Lewis, I mean, you're really dealing with a very, very big personality, as well as, a great rock and roll star. So I can't imagine anybody wanted to follow Jerry Lee.
Now, one of the things that I found in taking a look at his career was that a lot of radio stations boycotted his music. Why do you feel that was?
I think it was the same sort of problem Elvis had as well in the very early days. The music was much more like the black music of the time, the R&B music of the time. And I think the country radio stations and white radio stations were reluctant to play rock and roll, because there's a very, very, very fine dividing line between country music, rockabilly, rock and roll, and even R&B. 50s R&B is a very fine dividing line across the whole thing. And I think it's people like Jerry Lee Lewis that really brought the audiences together in a great way. Famously, audiences in those days in America were segregated. And it was when people like Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley performed to the kids of the time that, they'd come together, they'd be dancing together. And I think it had quite a big sociological effect as well.
Now, Jerry Lee Lewis, he became very famous very fast.
Yeah.
I don't want to use the term overnight success, because he really wasn't an overnight success. I don't think there's any such animal as an overnight success. What I feel is that it takes time to get to where you are, but he went there a lot faster than others. Do you think that was a factor in how he was perceived as a performer? Because he went from nobody to the killer in it, like almost after one song.
Yeah, pretty much as you said. His first single for Sun was Crazy Arms, much more of a country feel to it. But in a way, I'm not saying he was overly lucky, but he was in the right place at the right time. I mean, Elvis and others had really pioneered rock and roll. So by the time you get to Jerry Lee, I mean, his first single came out in the December of '56. So it was that 1956 where America really broke, rock and roll really broke across America. I mean, Elvis started as a local hero at the beginning of the year, and the end of the year, he'd signed to RCA and Heartbreak Hotel. So Jerry Lee Lewis was really swept along slightly, I think, in the rock and roll craze that in 1957 was really breaking, because Buddy Holly was really starting to find his feet by then as well. Little Richard was well established. In fact, Little Richard left the world of rock and roll in 1957 on tour in Australia. So he was there right at the epicenter, I think, and his style was what Rocky personified rock and roll in a way. His style was what rock and roll was all about. It was raucous, it was in your face, and it was very much him. And he had, three very big hits across a period of a year or so, less than a year probably, if you look at the various months. Whole Lot of Shaking, Breathless, and Great Balls of Fire, and they're all fabulous songs, and they're all just jam-packed with energy. And I think that's one of the reasons that he came onto the scene very quickly. It was just that the scene was exploding at the time, and he was as good as anybody and better than most at the genre. So you could say it was kismet almost. He really didn't have to convince anybody that his music was good. He was what the music scene was all about, along with another half a dozen people.
So the radio stations that didn't ban him and his music, they kind of saw the music differently than the ones that did ban him. What was their take on? Was it because it fit into their formats per se, or did they
Well,
see something that others didn't?
I think I think the second comment there is absolutely spot on the ball. They saw something that other people just didn't see. In fact, Steve Allen, when nobody would play whole lot of shaking going on, and his early stuff. Steve Allen had him on his show when other radio stations wouldn't play it, and he actually called one of his sons. In fact, the one of Myra Gale's children, Steve Allen Lewis, and I think that's very much it. I think it's like any period in music. I mean, music went through massive change across the middle 50s, and it carried on changing dramatically into the late 60s. And I think, some people are caught in a trough almost, and they don't manage to see that this whole new area is opening up. And, you're always going to, in music particularly, I think you're always going to get the more conservative elements who tend to stay with what they know. And then when something is unprecedented, because it was totally unprecedented rock and roll when it arrived in 55, 56, 57. I mean, there really had to be nothing like it. If you leave jazz and R&B to one side, big bands and crooners, kids like what their dads liked and dads like what their granddads liked, basically. Music hadn't really
Right.
changed significantly for a long time. And then over a period of a year or so, across 56, it was just a whole new world.
Yeah, and Jerry Lee Lewis started to tour, and as his popularity grew, his tours grew as well.
Yeah,
And he started to live that rock and roll lifestyle. He bought cars, he bought a house, he got married not once, not twice, but three times during the peak of his career. And the first two marriages kind of overlapped each other because the second marriage that he had was actually 23 days before the first marriage had ended. So he basically committed a crime in doing that. But that was forgivable compared to what he did next, which was marrying his 13-year-old cousin once removed. Let's
that's
talk
right.
about that as we get to the break and how it affected him.
Well, it certainly affected his career. He'd very much well, what was I he'd very much
Well, like the marriage itself didn't come out while he was touring North America. It actually came out when he went overseas to the UK, and he was touring in the UK, and a reporter in the UK came across the information that she was his cousin and underage. And Jerry Lee Lewis tried to play it off that she was 15, but it turns out she was 13 and had her first child at 14. And that, I think, was unforgivable to the fans, especially in the UK.
yeah. Basically, what happened was that after about three very poorly received concerts, he was kicked off his own headlining tour and was replaced by a skiffle artist at the time, Chas McDevitt. But it really was. I think a lot of it was as well was the deception. They're trying to suggest she was 15, but I mean in the UK, that would still be considered to be very, very, very young. But what's interesting is that I mean his fourth single, High School Confidential, sales collapsed for that, and he did attempt damage limitation. Sun Records tried damage limitation. He released a single, which was essentially a mock interview where the answers were snippets of Jerry Lee Lewis songs, and then a week or two after, he actually had a full-page ad in Billboard magazine, which is sort of an apology to the industry, because he realized he could see that his popularity was very, very much on the wane.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When he went over to the UK, that tour was going to be highly successful until the news came out. And once the news came out, the outrage that uh the people in the UK showed to him and his defiance, I don't think really helped him at all. Because at first he was defiant and, he was basically, I am who I am and I'm going to do what I do. And, there's nothing you can say about it. And the fans just went, okay, fine. We won't say anything. We just won't show up your shows. And well, and, it brought him basically to his knees in a career sense.
Yeah, very much. What's interesting is the his career in the UK actually did carry on. He continued to have more hit singles in the UK. I mean, in America, the singles dried up fairly quickly in that early part of his career. Well, up to the time of the Myra Gale marriage. I mean, interesting enough, you could say he was at the pinnacle of his career at that point, because on the 17th of May, 58, Faraday, his hometown, announced the first Jerry Lee Lewis Day. And that was literally, days, weeks before the American tour when it all came tumbling down. So you can see that things turned around for Jerry Lee Lewis over a very, very short period of time.
Yeah, and as we're getting to our break, one of the things that I have to admire about Jerry Lee Lewis is that he never gave up. He tried to fight the good fight, even though it was a fight he basically couldn't win. And do you think that defiance, we'll call it, was what kind of saved him in the long run?
Oh, I think so. And I think in some ways he just eventually picked up his career on the countryside, because he was essentially, you could almost argue he was a country artist with crossover hits. If you actually look at the the charts themselves, he had more hits on the R&B charts, top 40s, than he did the pop charts. But on the country charts, he had 52 top 40 country songs. And I think he went to acting as well, and that was part of the time that he really rekindled his career. So, and as you say, he never really stopped touring. I mean, never really stopped touring or performing up until very shortly before he died. He was still on stage. So I think he probably had a very, very strong self-belief. And I think that drove him as well. And I think in his heart of hearts, he probably thought he'd been unfairly treated because he'd done nothing illegal. I mean, apart from the fact that he was technically not married, so he was arguably a bigamist 2 or 3 times in his life. But his marriage was a legal marriage, and I think he probably felt that he was being a bit hard done by the reaction to what was going on. But I think his very personality sustained him, and I think it got him through what would have been an absolute career ender for most other artists. It's hard to think of many artists who could survive a fall of that magnitude and then rekindle a career, possibly in a slightly different direction, but then create for effectively their whole life. I mean, the guy was a star for the whole of his life. When you think about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, he'd long been out of the world of rock and roll then. But he was in the inaugural year with Little Richard and Elvis Presley. and just about everybody who was anybody in that 50s rock and roll world.
Now, in the first half of the show, we talked about his early career a little bit, some of the things that he accomplished, and some of the foibles that he had. And right now, we're going to take a look. We've gotten to the point where he has just married his 13-year-old cousin, once removed. We got to keep emphasizing that once removed part, so it's not quite as creepy as it is. And his career has kind of fallen off, especially in North America. And what happens next with Jerry Lee Lewis? He's at a moment. He's at a point in his career where he probably, he couldn't get people to throw water on him if he was on fire, and he's defiant to the end. And as you said before we went to the break, he performed right to his last days at age 87. How did he get past this section, and what did he do? How did he adapt?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's two different transitions, because what happened with Jerry Lee in the UK is very different. Following the Myra Gale first Jerry Lee tour of Jerry Lee tour of the UK. What happened was High School Confidential wasn't released here until the beginning of 1959. Then they must have seen that things weren't going well. But it was a hit over here. It was a number 12 when it was released in the January. And then what's interesting is there were a bunch of records, half a dozen or so, singles that were released across the next 3 or 4 years in the UK that just weren't released in America. So in 59, he had a hit with Living Up a Storm, 60, Baby, Baby, Bye Bye. And then 1961, one of the critical songs in his career, What I Say. So I'll come back to that. And then in 62, Sweet Little 16, and 63, Good Golly Miss Molly. So you see he's very much, Sweet Little 16, Good Golly Miss Molly. They're 50s classics. So he carried on having hits over here up until 63. And then his next week, it stops over here then. His next one, he had one more in the early 70s. What seemed to happen in the States was that it sort of ran down. And after the tour there, High School Confidential was pretty much his last major hit there. But in 61, he had a big hit across all of the Billboard Top 40s and the UK with Ray Charles' song, What'd I Say? And that's when his career seems to start to pick up again in the early 60s. He had another couple of minor hits, but only in the country charts. He had his last R&B hit with What'd I Say? His last top 40 with Me and Bobby McGee that was a 1972 again. It's interesting. His career seems to, in some ways, go into the doldrums, and then it jumps up. In the late 60s and early 70s, he was really starting to make his mark again.
Now, the fact that some of his songs were making a bit of an impact on the country charts, but not on the rock charts, is that kind of where Jerry Lee Lewis and his people looked at it and said, maybe we need to change directions at this point?
Yeah, I think so. What I find fascinating is, so many of these songs, of his songs, particularly in the early days, appeared on the pop rock, R&B, and country music. So in some ways, it depends how you're defining the songs themselves. His country music wasn't really down that Nashville sound that became very popular, Chet Atkins and the like. He had a much rawer feel to his country music. So I think he again was to the side of the mainstream in a way.
Now, another person we didn't mention who is a country superstar is Mickey Gilley, his other cousin.
Yeah.
And did Mickey have any influence on him in the way he performed country music?
I think they may well have done because Swaggart as well. I think played guitar and performed a bit, and I think they played together a lot in the early days. But to be honest, I'm not really sure how much um, overall influence he would have taken from there. But I would think he would have been influenced by him as well.
Now we've got Jerry Lee Lewis, who, if I'm looking at him, I'm going, there's a rock star. And now he's performing country music. Was the country crowd as welcoming as the rock and roll crowd was when he was at his peak?
I think so. I mean, it's interesting. He didn't make his debut at the Grand Ole Opry until '73, because he really had his real renaissance came from about 1968 across the '70s, and it really ended at the top 40 wise in 1981. And so he was establishing himself with the country artists as well. I don't think he became a regular at the Grand Ole Opry, but certainly, in the '70s, he appeared there at the very much the epicenter of country music.
Now, you mentioned that he made his debut in '76, was it?
'73.
'73. And I understand, as I recall working a country station, I had a chance to what they call some of the shows that were simulcast to our station from the Grand Ole Opry. And it's a very time-driven show. Like, you have this long to do this, you have that long to do that. And Jerry Lee Lewis showed us that he can't tell time either. He kind of went out and did his own thing. Did that affect him at all with the Grand Ole Opry, or did they just shrug their shoulders and go, that's Jerry?
I think it's just that's Jerry. I mean, there's a quote I can't possibly use live on air when he addresses the audience and basically says, "Look, I'm Jerry Lee Lewis. I am take me or leave me." The quote's in the book if you if you want to check it out. But he very much talked to his audience in that sort of way. I think he very much wanted people to just take him as he is. Basically, I'm a serious performer here.
And here's the book, by the way. And you'll notice it's a very big, thick book. To me, it is the Bible of early rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s. So there are a lot of great things in there, including about Jerry Lee Lewis, among others. And another thing that I noticed, now the name escapes me, but there was a Grand Ole Opry member who really greatly embraced Jerry Lee when he was first coming into country music and that. And he invited him to perform on stage with him at a show. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, I can't remember. I know Hank Snow was very involved with Elvis, helping Elvis in the early days. I'm not sure it was Hank Snow, though, with Jerry.
Just give me one quick second here. Now, another thing that I noticed with Jerry Lee Lewis was that he had a lot of great accolades bestowed upon him. And most of them are very well deserved, including a star on the Walk of Fame of all things, which I think is very cool. And also, he had the induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But having said that, well, you know what? I'll let you tell the story. You tell us all about his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating, really, that he was in that first tranche with Elvis, Little Richard, and everybody who was everybody there. And what's interesting is he wasn't actually inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. until just before he died.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it. I was able to pull it up, and the show that I was talking about that Jerry Lee Lewis played at the Grand Ole Opry was a 40-minute performance, and the average performance for the Grand Ole Opry is 2 songs or 8 minutes of stage time maximum.
Wow.
And the gentleman that he invited was Del Wood, the one member of the Opry who was kind to him when he was there as a teenager, and brought him out on stage to sing with him. And among the songs that he performed at the Grand Ole Opry in that 40-minute performance were a whole lot of shaking going on, Working Man Blues, Good Golly Miss Molly, and a whole bunch of his other classics.
Yeah.
So he basically put the rock and roll hall or the Grand Ole Opry on its ear with a whole lot of rock and roll, and that takes some guts, if you ask me personally.
That's right. I mean, it's just the way he was. He also appeared in the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival show in 1969, which was interesting. I actually found up on the internet or YouTube the show he gave then, and that was very much how he was. He would address his audience very much as, "This is me. This is the kind of music I like to play. This is what I'm going to play." And that's famous, of course, because John Lennon's Plastic Ono band played there for the first time. So he was in some pretty illustrious company. I mean, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Jerry Lee Lewis were there from the 50s. Doors were headlining. And John Lennon was playing there for the first time, the debut of the Plastic Ono band. And, Jerry Lee Lewis was very much a part of that. And, watching that performance, I mean, the guy had just addressed the audience with so much confidence. And I think that's just very much part of his makeup.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always loved about Jerry Lee Lewis in any of the videos that I've seen is, as you mentioned earlier, he loves to play the piano standing up.
Absolutely.
He also loves to play standing on the piano.
That's right.
We told the story earlier about the one time he set his piano on fire.
Yes.
And there's one thing that I didn't realize. I thought it was always intentional. But apparently the first time this happened, it was accidental, was when he stood up and he kicked the piano bench away by accident. And it bounced down the stage.
Yeah.
And there was such a positive reaction to that because everybody thought it was part of the show that he made it an integral part of the show. So he was not only a good piano player, not a great singer, but he was a good showman as well. He knew what the people wanted and he knew how to address the people. And I think that was a major factor in how he performed and how his career had the longevity that it had, was that he was so personable to the people.
Yeah, he was a real showman. And also another couple of incidents that helped describe the man. He nearly lived up to his nickname, the Killer, in '76 when he accidentally shot his bass player, guy called Norman Owens, who actually sued him. I don't know how the lawsuit went. And another time he was waving a gun around. It was in 1976 outside Graceland. But he wanted to see Elvis waving a gun around and shouting at the security man to tell Elvis the Killer's here to see him. But the security man called the police and Jerry Lee Lewis got arrested. But it just shows the kind of character he was, really. He did live the character that he portrayed on stage, I think, which is one of his real benefits.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, he has won a lot of accolades over the course of his career. I mentioned his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which he got in June of 1989. In October 10th of 2007, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he won the American Music Masters Award from them, plus the fact that he was inducted as the first person in the first class on in that inaugural class at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He won 4 Grammys, including a Lifetime Achievement and 2 Hall of Fame awards. And he was also inducted into the Memphis Hall of Fame and the Country Hall of Fame in 2022. So it shows just how his music resonated with everybody, not just rock and roll, not just country, but it resonated with everybody. And he also had a movie made about his life.
That's right.
Well, his early career and up to the point that it kind of crashed. And that was Great Balls of Fire, which had the great Dennis Quaid playing the killer. And he actually played piano in the movie.
Oh, wow.
So that,
Yeah, I think,
to me, that says a lot about somebody, that you can have that many accolades, that sell 300,000 copies of his first song before a whole lot of shaking came out. He sold 300,000 copies of his first song, and that was just the beginning. And when he sold the 300,000 copies, nobody knew who he was. And then a whole lot of shaking came out, and then boom, there he was everywhere.
yeah. And I think he was highly respected in the industry as well. I mean, in 2006, he recorded an album called Last Man Standing. And that was a series of duets and the like with people like Little Richard. But Bruce Springsteen, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards all appear on that. So you can see, across the industry itself, he was very highly rated by some of the biggest names in the business, really.
Yeah, and he comes about it honestly, because he's not the only one who is musically inclined. As I mentioned, Mickey Gilley was, as well as his sister, Linda Gale Lewis, who was very, very famous and is still performing today. She does some great stuff. Actually, I just recently played a couple of her recent songs on my morning show, and she is very, very talented. And you can feel that Jerry Lee Lewis vibe in her music as well. And a gentleman that I had an opportunity to talk to a while ago, who was very deeply influenced by Jerry Lee Lewis and had a chance to meet him. That was, oh man, his name escapes me. I should really plan these things ahead, but Jason D. Williams is his name. And he is deeply influenced by his music, and he loves to play the piano just as hard and as rockin' and raucous as the Killer did. And I think that speaks volumes for who he was and what he gave to us as fans. Do you have any final takes on the Killer before we call it a day?
Well, I think that he's has to be one of the absolute stars of not just rock and roll, but rock and roll across country. I mean, he had a unique style, basically, which is why he's always thought of as a rock and roller. But he found most of his hit records in the country music, and it's just awesome to think that those two genres could mesh so effectively, where you've got the rock and roll personality, the rock and roll attitude, the rock and roll songs across into a whole adjacent genre. I mean, what a guy.
Yeah, and for me, I just love the feel of his music. Whole Lot of Shakin', Breathless, High School Confidential, Great Balls of Fire, which we're going to play at the end of the interview. Just his music just gets me tapping my toes and feeling good about myself, feeling good about what's going on around me. Um, how do you feel about Jerry Lee Lewis and his music?
Well, as you say, I mean, it's real foot tapping music. It's powerful music. It's the kind of music that gets you listening, gets you going. It's got atmosphere. To see that kind of music played live is absolutely awesome. And I think he was very much part of that rock and roll couple of 3 years, 56, 57, 58 into 59. He very much was one of the driving forces of that, along with Elvis and Little Richard and Buddy Holly in a slightly different way. And I think that, if you look at how rock and roll changed not just the face of music, I mean, the whole youth culture effectively came out of that. The 1960s really started in the UK in 1963 with the Beatles, and the rock and roll aspect just rolls forward to this day, basically. And I think he must have been a massive influence on an awful lot of piano players who are looking to get some excitement into their music.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, one of those people was Elton John, who was influenced by Jerry Lee Lewis as well. And he made his first recordings in 1952, and he was still making music right up to the 2000s. That's 50 years of being who he is and being true to himself and being popular. He was still drawing crowds to shows. He was still pumping them out as hard as he could. Maybe the shows weren't as long as they had been in the past, but he was the showman. He was the original piano man, and he was the killer. And, I don't think there'll ever be another.
No, I mean, he performed at the Florida Strawberry Festival in 2018. I think his last concert was in South Carolina in 2019. So, I mean, the guy was performing right till the end. Incredible feat.
Yeah, and the killer is one of those guys. I think that his peak career was that early point, and I think that he hit that peak so fast. I think that was
Mm.
part of his downfall
Mm.
overall. And like I said, he remained popular, but unfortunately, he faded a little bit. It didn't help some of the things that he did, but I think he faded a little bit because I think it was too much too soon. And with
Mm.
that, I want to thank you for stopping by and spending some time with us talking about Jerry Lee Lewis, the killer. And on our next show, we're going to be talking about Little Richard. And we're going to have some good times talking about that. He is another great piano player. And in coming weeks, we'll be
Absolutely.
talking about the Beatles. We'll probably be doing two or three of the Beatles because they have so many different facets of who they are. And we'll have our good buddy Steve Chelmsford chime in as well on those. Plus, Chuck Berry will be on later on. We'll take a look at Roy Orbison, among others. And I'm sure you've got a few that you'd like to take a look at as well. And thanks for listening. Derek, thank you for coming by. Take care. Be good.
My
Love
pleasure.
you all. See you next time.